So, welcome back to a hopefully more on time update summary video this time round. And as usual, we'll go over all the new ships first, and then over all the other minor and major changes. So, first off for the ships, we have USS Bagley, a rank 2 battle rating 4.0 American destroyer. The addition of Bagley finally completes the American 4.0 lineup, and the Bagley is quite an interesting looking ship as well. The front two 5-inch 38 guns are mounted in the same turrets as the Fletcher, whilst the rear ones are on different mounts, and this does actually affect the reload rate. Because the front turrets have a ammo elevator directly into the gunhouse, they have a faster reload, the same reload as the Fletcher. Whilst the rear turrets do not have a direct ammo elevator connection between the ready racks and the gun, they have a somewhat slower reload, the same reload as the Alwyn. This reload difference is not as noticeable as you'd think, with it just leading to a slightly reduced rate of fire compared to if they were all the same turrets as a Fletcher. And the Bagley has quite an interesting torpedo loadout and location, with 4 quadruple launchers, 2 on either side of the ship, behind the funnel. This torpedo loadout is quite heavy, and the American torpedoes are not bad, especially in close range fights. Though despite these launchers being wing launchers, they do not have the greatest forward and rearward firing arcs. Overall, I've spaded Bagley recently and it is a fun ship and definitely a worthwhile addition to the 4.0 lineup. Then next we'll move to Russia with a coastal edition, the PR-253L. This is quite a fun little boat. Especially at 1.7, a very nice battle rating for coastal where you do not see any blue water vessels. The guns on the 253L reload quite quickly and have relatively high velocity. One thing I do want to note though is that you need to be very careful with your shell choices. Because you have 2 HE shells and an HE base fuse shell. The stock shell has a lower explosive mass compared to the second shell, but a much higher muzzle velocity, so do not take the quote-unquote upgraded contact fuse HE shell. And base fuse shell, well, I use that as my secondary shell, but it is not that important. In most situations you'll be just fine with the stock HE. For those observant among you, I've put the Carmi next to the PR-253L, because it is vaguely similar in gun layout, but with much bigger guns. So if you're familiar with Carmi, you should be pretty familiar with PR-253. I will note though, the PR-253 is very slow. Though at 1.7 this usually doesn't matter too much. Then next on my list we have HMS Renown. Oop, that was a mistake of me. Clearly this is HMS Repulse. And that is quite a silly mistake to make, isn't it? Who could possibly mistake Repulse for Renown? They clearly have such very visual distinct superstructures and secondary armament. It would be insane to compare these two vessels and not think somebody who vaguely knows their ships wouldn't recognize the difference. Cough, cough. Anyways, HMS Repulse. Quite a cool ship, sitting at rank 6 at a battle rating of 6.7 for some reason. And, well, there's not much to say about it. Repulse looks pretty good. Compared to HMS Renown, its sister ship, it does have slightly less effective anti-air armament, especially in the long-range anti-air department. But nonetheless, HMS Repulse looks pretty good. Their ammunition also seems to be slightly lower in the water compared to Renown. So yeah, another fun note about HMS Repulse is that it'll be the first British capital ship with a float plane, this being the ever-lovable Walrus. So yeah, that's HMS Repulse. Then next in the list we have the Japanese Murasame, a rank 2 battle rating 4.3 destroyer. And quite a modern one at that. It shares the same hull as the coastal frigate JDS Ayanami, but with a upgraded gun armament as you can see, carrying 5-inch 54 guns, these being in 3 single mounts. I didn't really like these guns all that much, to be perfectly honest. There's only 3 of them to begin with, and they do have a slightly longer reload than a 5-inch 38. They're not bad guns, but they're just... Compared to some other ships you could have in the Tech 3, premium and event ships included, you have Harakaze, which is a Tech 3 ship, a lower BR with 5-inch 38s, which in my opinion is actually slightly better at close range fighting than Murasame. You have stuff like Yugure at the same battle rating, which is just a Fletcher, but with 4 turrets instead of 5. So Murasame to me feels a little bit mediocre. It is definitely a cool boat, it is another Japanese destroyer, but do temper your expectations a bit. Another cool feature is that you can control the 3-inch guns together with the main guns, but sadly these 3-inch guns do not get any AP shells, which confuses me a little, seeing that the predecessor class, the JDS Ayanami, does get AP. But oh well. Then, next on the list we have a premium vessel, this being the Italian MS-444. There's not much to say about this, battle rating 2.7, rank 3 premium, other than it's an American PT boat but with a slightly unique armament layout, with the ever-reliable 40mm bowfers in the rear, and a 20mm in the middle, and then two 20mm in the front. This is not a bad layout. It carries Italian torpedoes, so might be better, might be worse than some American variants. The gun layout is pretty good. Battle rating of 2.7 is average. It can be a little bit rough, but it's a right BR for this kind of vehicle. Rank 3 does make it a pretty decent premium to pick up if you're interested in grinding the Italian coastal tree, which I would recommend, especially for getting SATA down the line. With the only other alternatives for premium vehicles being the somewhat lackluster Falaga and the inconsistent Sparviero. So MS-444 wouldn't be a bad one to pick up for Italy, but it is ultimately for you to decide. Then back to some Tech 3 vehicles, and sticking with Italy, we go to the Francesco Caracciolo, if that is how you pronounce it. This is a 6.7 battleship, at rank 6 of course. Francesco Caracciolo looks pretty promising, being armed with 8 15-inch guns, the first appearance of this caliber in Italian 3, but sadly they're not the famous Italian 15-inch guns, rather they're earlier variants of this gun caliber. Francesco Caracciolo also is pretty standard in the armor department for a battleship of this era and type. It is of course a uncompleted battleship, much like the Amagi, but well, a step or 2 or 3 behind Amagi. The 15-inch guns are also not the greatest, with a rather poor performing subshell, although it should be plenty enough against other dreadnought type battleships, but it might struggle against the American standards and some of the post-treaty battleships. Other than that, Francesco Caracciolo is a neat addition, having surprisingly heavy anti-air armament as well for a ship of this type. But yeah, I don't own the ship myself yet, so I can't really say with full confidence how it plays like, but it's an interesting one nonetheless. Then, moving on to probably one of the most hype additions this update, is the French battleship Dunkirk, or Dunkerque, Dunkerque, however you want to pronounce it. Battle rating 6.7 at rank 6. Dunkirk is a very unique battleship, which is apparent by the 2 quadruple turrets in the front and no other main gun armament. Dunkirk is also not a ship I own yet. I don't own any of the capital ships yet this update, but it looks fairly promising. The armor is on the lighter side of things for this battle rating, although it is a 6.7, which is very surprising to me, although I've heard people not quite like its performance. So I'll have to find out myself how it really performs. But despite these rumors of its lackluster performance, it'll definitely be a neat upgrade over the current stock of French battleships. One thing I do want to note about its Dunkirk, other than its amazing looks of course, is that you should not, and I do repeat, do not go straight bow into your opponents. This is not World of Warships, that is not how armor works in this game. The bow plating of this ship is 25mm of structural steel. This, I think, has an effective thickness of, is it 0.45? So Dunkirk's bow itself does not really provide much armor. So seeing as the bow itself isn't any armor and not thick enough to cause auto bounces like it would in the other naval game, you have to consider what the armor behind it is, and that is just a square plate of 210mm. Around about battlecruiser standards in terms of armor plating, which, as you can imagine, at 6.7 is not thick enough to stop anything, and the thing that lies directly behind this 210mm armor plate is your magazine. So, as a small PSA, do not go straight bow in with Dunkirk. one of the best ways to angle the ship is actually about 45 degrees, because you do not want to angle your bow, you want to angle your citadel, which is a box. So much like new Tiger players, do not show your flat front to the enemy, angle. Okay? Angle. But I think that is enough about Dunkirk. It is a very interesting looking ship and I'm looking forward to getting it, though I do not have the highest of expectations from what I've heard from other people. Then a technical addition to this update is French Coastal is now available to everybody. Whether you bought into it with the premium pack or if you got the stars or not, doesn't matter. Everybody now has access to French Coastal. And as some of you might have already seen, I have been playing French Coastal on stream, I think 3 times now, 4 times. And I will say it is a pretty fun tree. It is pretty short as of now, it is also still pretty cheap for a coastal tree, so progress through it goes pretty smoothly. I haven't yet gotten into rank 4 and 5 for the French coastal tree, but it does look fairly promising. So all in all, very good naval additions. So what exactly got changed then this update? Well, let's go over some of the bigger, more noticeable changes. Or the more impactful changes in my opinion. Probably the most noticeable one right off the gate is the new gun sight camera. This is now placed higher in the ship, I think approximately the same height as the highest point of the ship, and now in the middle of your ship, rather than hovering vaguely in front of the bridge over your front turrets. What this means is that for destroyers this isn't the biggest change. However, because the gun sight has been moved from roughly near your front turrets to the center of the ship, this means you have a bit more parallax from your front guns to the sight, and less so from the rear guns to your sight. So this can mean that some shots which previously you would have made around islands, you no longer can, and vice versa. This takes some getting used to, but it is easy enough to get used to on destroyers. On capital ships though, it gives you a completely different perspective of maps and range. It is somewhat disorienting, especially since I don't play that many capital ships and I still haven't quite gotten used to the new view. It does give you a whole lot more information, as you can see enemy ships much more clearly, and might somewhat deal with the annoying, oh, you can look onto a ship behind an island which you don't really see. Maybe you'll actually see them now. But again, I haven't played enough capital ships to really figure out if that's the case. Another thing that this higher gun sight has caused to is that engagements at very close range and where the range keeps closing rapidly have become a little bit more difficult. It is somewhat hard to explain this in words, but basically know that if you're at very close range and there's like a coastal boat closing on you very rapidly, instead of trying to use your scroll wheel to adjust the range, just use the lock-on button over and over again. That'll be much safer than trying to scroll wheel. But yeah, that's the new gun sight. I'm not opposed to it. It takes some getting used to though, that's for sure. Then another quite noticeable change is the shell hit icons, I'll call them. These basically display if you've hit the target, how many of those hits penned, bounced or overpenned. In my opinion this is interesting data to know, but its placement in the HUD is really awkward. Putting it in the center of the screen above your gun sight and basically on top of the target is just so much visual clutter. If you look at a full HUD that you have available in Naval, you have your target damage state in the top right, which also got slightly changed, but we'll get back to that. You have your kill feed on the right hand side of the screen, you have your minimap in the bottom right, you have your toolbar bottom center, you have your own damage state and your own orientation stuff and gun status stuff in the bottom left, you have the battle chat in the center left, you have your radar and gun director in the top left, and then now you have this hit cam in the center middle, top middle, together with the kill messages. And on top of all of that, you still have your little lead indicator calculating thing in the middle of your gun sight. It is a very visually cluttered HUD, and to be very honest, it's about time they either make it customizable or they need to shuffle some things around, because it is a lot of information to take in and can be a little bit annoying to look at after a while. But now the hit cam changes things to the X-ray view on the top right. They fiddled around a bit with the icons below an enemy ship. This now has some more states. This shows, okay, is the enemy on fire? Are there magazines on fire? Are they flooding? Basically, just more information. Useful enough, didn't really change too much compared to the old one. And then an interesting one, which I want to say is a major change, but you could arguably say it's a minor change. With the hit analysis thing that got introduced for everybody, it is quite interesting for Naval, because it will record all your shell hits, which to be honest gets cluttered quite quickly in a little overview, but it'll also record torpedo hits and anti-air shell hits, which is always cool to look at, especially torpedo hits. I find that to be quite useful. So yeah, that's just a neat, probably minor change. So to continue on with the minor changes for arcade, the lead calculation time has been drastically reduced on all ships, which means that in arcade you'll get your lead indicator much quicker, which in my eyes makes sense for arcade. Then we have some various graphical changes. Most of these are very general graphics changes, just especially in terms of reflectivity of the water, I've noticed. But yeah, there are some Naval specific graphical additions and changes. One of these additions being a debris field that now spawns as the ship sinks, though sadly this only stays around for a couple of seconds before despawning as well. If this was a permanent thing, that would be kind of cool, but no well. These debris fields are also not really all that visually spectacular, they're not that distinct. I've played quite a few matches now, playing the new vehicles, grinding them, and you don't really notice these debris fields unless you're sailing right through them. So it's a minor change for that regard. Another more interesting change is fire effects. There are a lot more cosmetic fires which do actually indicate something, but doesn't necessarily mean that the enemy ship is taking fire damage. If I recall correctly, there's actually 3 visually distinct fire types. The one, of course, being this very thick black smoke producing fire, the very small deck planks on fire, and I think the older fire that we're used to at this point. So these fire effects implying heavy damage without you actually being on fire is quite interesting, because at a glance you can tell, oh, that ship has been damaged, has been hit quite severely, but not necessarily on fire. So this can now be a visual indicator for both damage done to a ship, as well as what kind of damage they've taken. So yeah, very interesting fire visual changes. Then next up, for those of you that have the event Tornado in Germany with the anti-ship missiles, the anti-ship missiles now have proper targeting parameters or algorithms or whatever they are. Instead of now going for the center of the geometry of a ship, they'll actually go for the hull of the ship, which might have some interesting implications, but I won't be reading into that too deeply just yet. Then on top of all of these changes I just discussed, there's a slew of other minor changes to models, bugs, visual models, all that kind of stuff, and of course they can always be read in the patch notes, and I always recommend you read those when a major update comes out. Although I must admit, I only really read the naval parts. And that's about it for this update. So to summarize again, a decent number of ships have been added, some very much sought after, some otherwise decent additions. The gun sight change is probably the biggest and most noticeable one, which will take some time getting used to, but it's not necessarily a bad change. But it does make some situations more difficult, some a little bit easier. Again, it's something we'll have to get used to. Then some HUD changes, which give us some more information, but do make it a little bit more cluttered. Then we have some various visual changes, which are always nice to see, especially if they're improvements, and so on and so on. Overall, I would say this update has been alright for Naval. Although I must say that I am still quite upset at the fact that they do not raise the maximum BR for Naval. We have been at 7.0 for the better part of 2 years now, and that really has to change at some point. Well, there is still usually one more update planned for this year, so we'll have to see what that'll bring. Although I do not have high hopes for this December update. Other than that, there's also the Operation Winter, which should make a return, and I'm looking forward to that one. But we'll have to wait and see what that'll bring. Anyways, that should be it for Update Firebirds when it comes from a naval perspective, and as usual, I thank you all for watching, and I'll see you around in the next one.